The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
Guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
I recently watched episode 8 of Andor, where I witnessed the Empire utilize a false flag operation to render itself a victim of unprovoked aggression, thereby becoming the wounded party and gaining for itself the moral authority to eliminate, with all haste, its enemies and ensure its security. But what if I told you that such actions are not limited to the imaginations of men, but are conceived and in some cases carried out materially in the real world, and we are usually none the wiser? But during the Cold War, there was one such false flag conceived by the wicked minds of the US government. In this video, I'm going to explain one of the most infamous proposed military operations in American history. After the end of the Second World War, the globe was locked into an ideological battle between the United States-led Capital West and the Soviet-led Communist East. The two blocs fought against one another in every field possible, such as nuclear arms races, proxy wars, espionage, propaganda campaigns, and the space race, and even sports. Both sides would even engage in immoral science experiments and military operations to get ahead of each other. Ultimately, each side sought the weakening, isolation, and the hopeful fall of the other. One way to achieve this was to bring as many nations as possible into their respective spheres of influence. This could be achieved by outright military conquests, such as Eastern Europe by the Soviets, or through clandestine operations, such as the US-backed coups in Iran and Guatemala. One of these nations that would become a tug-of-war between these two great powers would be Cuba. In the 1950s, the island fell to Castro and his communist comrades and would begin to align itself more and more with the Soviet bloc. The United States didn't want a Soviet-aligned country literally in its backyard, so the US Joint Chiefs of Staff decided to propose a plan so diabolical, so evil, that you wouldn't believe it, at least not before watching this video. The plan that I'm going to discuss today is Operation Northwoods, a false flag operation that called for attacks against US military and civilian targets. Attacks that would then be blamed on the Cubans and be used to justify a US invasion of Cuba. Everything from bombings in Miami to blowing up airplanes to faking an attack on US military bases was up for consideration. A plan truly born out of desperation to ensure that the communists couldn't set up shop right next to Florida. Operation Northwoods was never implemented as it was rejected by Kennedy, and it would remain a secret until it was declassified as part of the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Record Collection Act of 1992. Though this operation never made it past the planning stage, it is still a great viewpoint into the psyche of American leaders during the Cold War and how far they were willing to go to achieve their objectives. In this video, I'm going to explain what this plan was in detail and give you a little background on what led up to it, so sit back and enjoy. The Cuban Problem. Cuba was originally colonized and controlled by the Spanish for over 300 years. However, in the late 1800s, the people of Cuba weren't too happy with Spanish rule. Turns out rampant corruption, slavery, massive economic inequality, and literal concentration camps aren't very popular. There were attempts to secure independence from Spain by force, but they were usually crushed brutally by the Spanish and local armed forces. The land and money-hungry, the humanitarian United States, looked over from across the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, with its sympathetic eyes. The Americans saw themselves in the poor and desperate Cubans fighting for independence from an oppressive European colonial power, an imitation of their own struggle some 100 years earlier. In 1895, the Cuban War of Independence would begin, with the United States providing moral support. American newspapers highlighted and usually exaggerated Spanish atrocities to drum up domestic support for the Cuban cause. Eventually, in January of 1898, due to rioting in Havana, the US government sent the USS Maine to Havana Harbor to protect American interests. About a month and a half later, it was blown up. Now, it was most likely due to an internal fire in the magazine, but that wasn't interesting, so the American media blamed the dirty Spanish. The US government also decided to go along with the popular narrative, because kicking the Spanish out of Cuba and taking the island for themselves was something that the United States had wanted to do since the early 1800s, so war it was. Long story short, the United States won and occupied Cuba. However, Congress made it clear that Cuba would not be annexed by the United States and would instead become an independent nation where control of the island belonged to its people. And by its people, I meant the American people, silly. But don't worry, this is nothing like how it was with the Spanish. The Cubans are free and independent as long as they do whatever the US wants. This ain't imperialism, this is democracy and freedom. Anyhow, the US forced Cuba to accept a constitution that gave the United States a legal right to intervene in Cuban domestic affairs to help maintain stability and the independence of Cuba. A right that the United States would exercise in 1906 when the US military intervened in Cuba and occupied the country to protect American interests, and then set up a new government. The US also got a lease on Guantanamo Bay for like forever, and pretty much took over the Cuban economy. American sugar interests would dominate, and American organized crime, such as the infamous Italian mafias, would dominate the island's drug trade, gambling, and many other illicit activities. The average Cuban would continue to live a life of poverty and oppression. Eventually in 1952, a gentleman by the name of Batista would overthrow the government in a coup, and declare himself a dictator. President. This would immediately lead to resistance forces forming on the island, such as the July 26th movement, led by Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. Che and Castro would engage in guerrilla operations against the government, and Batista would respond with more and more brutal tactics, such as summary executions and torture. The US originally supported the Batista government, but quickly turned against him after its increasing authoritarianism and brutality. An arms embargo against Cuba will be imposed, and the American ambassador will be withdrawn. This greatly crippled Batista's forces and delegitimized his government. The US even went as far as to provide financial support to Castro, hoping to win his favor, and hopefully lead him to form a stable, humanitarian, and most importantly, an American-friendly government that allowed the US to continue dominating the island. Well, things didn't go that way. Once Castro gained control of the island, he wasn't too happy with the US government's previous support of Batista and their general exploitation of the Cuban people. He would condemn the US government in speeches, postpone free and fair elections, nationalize American-owned property, legalize the Communist Party, and begin forming close ties with the Soviet Union. The US was completely taken aback. Why were the Cuban people upset? They should say thank you for being liberated by Uncle Sam. Relations would quickly sour, and the United States began to see Castro as a serious threat, and the CIA was already planning to oust Castro in 1959. The US wanted a Cuban government more in line with the interests of the Cuban people. In April of 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion was launched to help overthrow the Cuban government. The invasion was planned by the CIA and authorized by Kennedy, and consisted of American-trained and organized anti-Castro Cuban exiles. The CIA planned for them to land in Cuba, storm the island, and hopefully be supported by a general uprising by the Cuban people against Castro. Unfortunately, this failed spectacularly. The CIA-backed Cuban exiles were quickly overwhelmed, and no general uprising occurred. Turns out that you can't overthrow a government with like 6 guys. Castro's position was solidified, and his turn towards the Soviet Union was accelerated. The whole fiasco was an embarrassment for the United States, and would lead directly into the Cuban Missile Crisis the next year. But the United States wasn't done yet. They still had one more plan up their sleeve before things got bad, and that would be the infamous Operation Northwoods, where the US planned to attack itself with a false flag to justify a war with Cuba. False flag operation. Now what is a false flag? Well, it's essentially an attack in which the actual source of responsibility is disguised, and another convenient innocent party is blamed. For example, let's say I want to invade my neighbor, but I had no legitimate reason. If I just went ahead and invaded without cause, everyone would view me as an unprovoked aggressor, and might even act against me. Everything from sanctions or military intervention could be imposed against me. Also, your people might protest against you and demand the resignation of your government. Essentially, you would find yourself in a very difficult situation, kind of like how Russia did in 2022 or Germany in 1939. But if you could show everyone that you were attacked first and that your opponent was a threat to world peace, well, you would have a much friendlier crowd watching you as you blitzkrieg your way to victory. With Cuba, the United States wanted to invade the island and place a friendly government by force, but they didn't have any justification. Without one, they would be condemned by the United Nations and the Association of American States, and would generally come off as an aggressive imperial power. Such an image would not be desirable when the memory of World War II was so fresh in people's minds. Also, the United States had painted itself as an anti-imperial power, and even criticized the British and other European powers for their continued practice of empire. Essentially, the US needed to be the victim in the eyes of the world. Unfortunately for the US, Cuba had no intention of attacking, as such a war would be suicide for even a seasoned government. Castro, after all, didn't survive 600 assassination attempts and schemes by being a fool. If Castro would not fire the first bullet at America, then the CIA and the US military certainly would. The best defense is an offense, they say. On November 30th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy authorized Operation Mongoose, a campaign of covert operations meant to overthrow the Cuban government. To supplement these efforts, the Joint Chiefs of Staff would present a plan to the chairman, General Lyman Littminster. The plan would be titled Operation Northwoods. The chief would sign off on it, and on May 13, 1962, he would send the plan to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and President Kennedy for approval. The plan was almost immediately rejected, and a few months later, the chairman was removed. What could have possibly been so bad that the president would reject the plan so outright? The same president that had no problem supporting a violent overthrow of the Cuban government with the Bay of Pigs invasion just 1 year earlier. Well, let's finally get into it. Operation Northwoods. The main purpose of Operation Northwoods was to paint Cuba as a rogue nation that was a threat to regional peace and provide justification for a US invasion, and also to paint the United States as the main victim of this roguish behavior, so that the international community wouldn't just tolerate a US response, but demand it quickly. But time was of the essence. In early 1962, Cuba was not yet in any sort of a military alliance with the Soviet Union and did not host any Soviet troops. The US needed to act before the Soviets became more involved. The operation itself laid out many possibilities for a false flag. The beginning of the document calls for the United States to disguise friendly Cubans as Castro soldiers. These disguised Cubans would then launch attacks against the US military facility at Guantanamo Bay. Attacks would include everything from storming the base, firing mortar shells, sneaking in to commit sabotage, or riding near the main gate. Furthermore, ammunition stores in the base could be blown up and fires could be started. The plan also recommended that the US could sink an empty naval ship and recreate the USS Maine incident. Mock funerals could be held for the sailors to make the attack appear more legitimate. In response, the US military could immediately move out from the base and occupy local areas, secure water and power supplies, and neutralize nearby military forces. In addition, the plan called for the US to sink additional unmanned drone ships near Havana and Santiago, blaming it on the Cubans, and saying that they were attacked by land, air, or sea. When Cuban ships or planes came over to investigate, the US could use that as further evidence that the Cubans were responsible. The US would then post fake casualty lists in American newspapers and create a helpful wave of national indignation. The operation document also stated the US could fly drone aircraft around Cuba and shoot them down, blaming the Cubans in the process and once again publishing false casualty lists. Now, these attacks in themselves aren't too bad. None of them call for any significant damage or any harm to any particular people. So far, this operation involves unmanned drone ships and plans, coordinated fake attacks, and fictional casualties. But while the plan didn't call for the death of American citizens, Cuban refugees would be another matter. The operation also called for a so-called Cuban communist campaign in and around the Miami area, and even in cities such as Washington, D.C. This would include assassinations and bombings against the Cuban refugee communities. In addition, the plan suggested that Cuban refugee boats could be sunk off the coast of Cuba. All attacks would then be blamed on the Cuban government. Now, the plan does state that the attacks on refugee ships could either be real or simulated, but the fact that there was even a possibility of blowing up innocent people is certainly wild. The plan also called for launching outright provocations against other Caribbean countries to purposely violate their airspace and make it appear as the Cubans were doing it. This would involve flying MiG-type aircraft disguised as being part of the Cuban Air Force. The US would also smuggle crates of weapons illegally into different Caribbean countries and make it appear as if Cuba was sending them to support local communist forces. This could further paint Cuba as a threat and hopefully lead to the Caribbean and other countries to support the idea of military intervention on the island. Furthermore, the plan proposed using fake civilian aircraft as potential targets. These aircraft would appear to be commercial planes filled with college students or people on vacation. The US can then claim that these planes were shot down by Cuban forces, further cementing the narrative that Cuba was a dangerous aggressor. The illusion of innocent lives lost would generate widespread outrage and public support for military intervention. Now, there isn't really much else in this plan, and I'll be honest, it wasn't really as bad as I thought it would be. Like, obviously using terror campaigns against Cuban refugees is bad, but I guess there was an operation to use a simulated attack. Now, the biggest issue with this plan wasn't exactly what happened during the plan itself, but what would come after. An actual invasion of Cuba would involve the deaths of real people, both military and civilians alike. Castro and his forces would fight to the end, and collateral damage would be unavoidable. This would essentially kind of be like the invasion of Iraq. Instead of faking weapons of mass destruction, you fake terrorist attacks. The fact that the Joint Chief of Staff believed that starting wars and killing people based on lies was truly the terrifying aspect of this entire operation. Such things are the works of dictatorships and not fair and open societies, but unfortunately, this would happen again. What's even wilder is that this plan remained classified for almost 30 years and was only released because of the John F. Kennedy assassination. If that had not occurred, well, this may have gone unnoticed forever. Governments throughout history have used false flag attacks to justify many atrocities. A famous example would be when Germany launched fake attacks against itself in 1939 and blamed the Polish, and we all know what happened afterward. Of course, the United States itself would succeed at launching a false flag operation just 2 years later on August 4th, 1964, in the Gulf of Tonkin near North Vietnam, and used that to justify a war in Vietnam in which over 50,000 American soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people would be killed. He also had the fake weapons of mass destruction story to justify the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and that war would lead to thousands of deaths among American soldiers and hundreds of thousands of deaths among the Iraqi people. To this day, that nation is still wrought with violence and instability. Such strategies are not merely relics of the past, but have ongoing implications. The use of deceit and manipulation to achieve political and military ends exemplifies a dangerous precedent. It raises important ethical questions about the lengths in which governments might go to secure their interests, often at the expense of truth and human lives. Conclusion. Operation Northwoods is a reminder of what governments are capable of doing. Though the plan was rejected by the president, it is still alarming that the Joint Chiefs of Staff could have recommended it. A president with a lower moral character would have surely gone along with it. As I said before, I recently saw episode 8 of Andor, where the Empire utilized a false flag operation to make it appear as if they were attacked by people of Gormon. Such an attack obviously gave the Imperial government a casus belli to fully invade the world and suppress all local resistance. The Empire was the victim and would have the moral authority to right all wrongs by any means possible. But again, it's important to remember that such actions are not limited to the imaginations of man, but are usually carried out materially, and we are usually none the wiser. Remember, this plan would have never been made public had it not been for the Kennedy assassination. This document was just among the thousands released because of its relation to the presidency of John F. Kennedy. If you learned anything, just remember to be vigilant, to question everything, and never accept the testimony of the government in blind trust. To avoid the loss of trust in the public institutions that uphold our very society, the government should be hard-pressed to ensure maximum transparency. Anyhow, thanks for watching, and have a great day.